It is the winter of 1943. In a prison cell in Saratov, Russia, a man is dying of starvation. He is 65 years old. He has spent the last 3 years in Soviet detention, arrested, tried, convicted of crimes he did not commit, transferred between facilities as his health collapsed. He has lost most of his body weight. He can no longer stand without assistance. His name is Nikolai Vavilov. He is the greatest botanist of the 20th century. He has traveled to 64 countries on 5 continents in search of the genetic origins of the world's food crops. He has built the largest collection of plant seeds ever assembled, over 250,000 specimens, representing the full diversity of everything humanity has ever grown to feed itself. He has dedicated his life, with a completeness that left almost no room for anything else, to understanding how the world's food supply could be protected against the famines that had killed millions of people throughout human history. He is dying of famine. In Leningrad, in a building he built, his collection sits preserved, guarded by his colleagues who are also starving, who have chosen to die rather than eat the seeds. There is a particular kind of tragedy that history reserves for people who are too far ahead of their time to be protected by it. Nikolai Vavilov was not ignored. He was not dismissed or overlooked or quietly sidelined. He was celebrated by the international scientific community, by the Soviet state in its earlier years, by governments around the world that recognized in his work the possibility of a future without mass starvation. And then the Soviet state decided that his science was politically inconvenient, that the man who had spent 3 decades trying to understand how to feed humanity was, in fact, an enemy of the people, a saboteur, a wrecker, a spy. The charges were fabricated. The trial was a performance. The verdict was predetermined, and the man who understood better than anyone alive how famine worked, what caused it, how to prevent it, what genetic resources humanity would need to survive it, was sentenced to death by the state he had served, and died in a prison cell of the condition he had devoted his life to preventing. This is the story of Nikolai Vavilov, and it is a story about what happens when ideology decides it knows more than science. Nikolai Vavilov was born in Moscow in 1887, the son of a successful textile merchant who valued education with the conviction of a man who had built something from nothing and understood that knowledge was the most durable asset a person could possess. From an early age, Vavilov was drawn to plants, not as objects of beauty but as objects of history. He became fascinated by a question that most people had never thought to ask: where did our food come from? Not in the immediate sense, but in the deep historical sense. Wheat, rye, barley, rice, maize, potato, the crops that fed the world had not always existed in their current forms. They had been developed over thousands of years by farmers who selected and saved the seeds of the most productive plants, generation after generation, until the wild ancestors of modern crops had been transformed into the domesticated varieties that civilization depended on. Vavilov believed that if you could find the geographic origins of those crops, the places where their wild ancestors still grew, where the greatest genetic diversity still existed, you would have found something of extraordinary scientific and practical value. A library of genetic material that could be used to breed new varieties resistant to disease, tolerant of drought, capable of growing in soils or climates where current varieties could not survive. He called these places centers of origin, and he spent the rest of his life finding them. Between 1916 and 1940, Vavilov led or organized over 100 expeditions to 64 countries. He traveled to Persia and Afghanistan in search of the origins of wheat, to Ethiopia and Eritrea for the wild ancestors of barley and sorghum, to Central and South America for the genetic roots of the potato and the tomato, to China, Japan, Korea, and across the breadth of the Soviet Union. He collected seeds, roots, tubers, and cuttings everywhere he went and shipped them back to Leningrad, where his institute cataloged, preserved, and studied them. By the late 1930s, the collection held over 250,000 specimens. It was the most comprehensive inventory of plant genetic diversity ever assembled. Scientists around the world recognized it as one of the most important scientific resources in existence. Vavilov himself was celebrated. He was elected to the Soviet Academy of Sciences. He received honorary degrees from universities across Europe. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize. And then Trofim Lysenko arrived. Trofim Lysenko was an agronomist from Ukraine who had developed a technique he called vernalization, the exposure of seeds to cold and moisture before planting, which he claimed could dramatically increase crop yields. His claims were extravagant. His methodology was poor. His results, when other scientists attempted to replicate them, were inconsistent at best and fraudulent at worst. By the standards of international plant science, Lysenko was not a serious researcher. He was a showman who had learned to frame his work in the ideological language that the Soviet state found most appealing. Lysenko rejected Mendelian genetics, the foundational science of heredity that Vavilov and virtually every other serious biologist in the world accepted as established fact. He rejected it not on scientific grounds, but on ideological ones. Mendelian genetics, he argued, was bourgeois science, incompatible with the materialist philosophy of Marxism-Leninism. In its place, he promoted a theory of inheritance based on the long-discredited ideas of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. The notion that organisms could pass on characteristics acquired during their lifetime to their offspring. Under Lamarckian theory, you could train wheat to grow in winter. You could teach crops to thrive in soil where they had never grown before. The yields Lysenko promised were exactly what a Soviet state struggling to feed its population wanted to hear. Stalin embraced Lysenko, and Lysenko, understanding exactly what this meant, began systematically attacking the scientists who disagreed with him. Vavilov was the most prominent target. The attacks began in the mid-1930s and escalated steadily. Lysenko accused Vavilov and his colleagues of promoting foreign, anti-Soviet science. He characterized the seed collection as a waste of resources, a monument to bourgeois academic vanity with no practical value for Soviet agriculture. He accused Vavilov of sabotaging Soviet food production by promoting theories that produced no results in the field. Vavilov fought back, publicly and privately. He defended genetics at scientific conferences with the full force of his international reputation. He believed, with the optimism of a man who had spent his career in institutions that valued evidence, that the truth would eventually assert itself. He was wrong about the institution he was operating in. In August 1940, Vavilov was arrested by the NKVD while on a botanical expedition in Ukraine. He was taken to Moscow, interrogated and charged with espionage, sabotage, and membership in a right-wing organization. The charges were entirely fabricated. Under interrogation that lasted hundreds of hours, Vavilov refused to confess to crimes he had not committed. The interrogators eventually produced a confession anyway. In July 1941, Vavilov was sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to 20 years in a labor camp. He was transferred to a prison in Saratov, where the conditions were brutal and the food was inadequate. His health deteriorated rapidly. He continued to ask, from his prison cell, for scientific journals. While Vavilov was dying in Saratov, his collection was fighting for its own survival in Leningrad. In September 1941, German forces completed the encirclement of Leningrad, beginning the siege that would last 872 days and kill approximately 800,000 civilians, most of them from starvation. The Vavilov Institute found itself inside a city being deliberately starved to death. The staff faced a situation of almost unbearable moral weight. They were sitting in a building that contained thousands of edible seeds, rice, wheat, corn, peas, oats, while people were dying of hunger in the streets outside. They did not eat the seeds. 12 staff members of the Vavilov Institute died of starvation during the siege of Leningrad. They died surrounded by food they had chosen not to consume. Among those who died was Dmitry Ivanov, the curator of the rice collection, found dead at his desk surrounded by bags of rice, and Alexander Stychukin, the curator of the peanut collection, who died with packets of peanuts in his desk drawer. They starved to death guarding seeds. Vavilov himself died on January 26, 1943, in his prison cell in Saratov. The official cause of death was dystrophy, the clinical term for starvation. He was 65 years old. He died not knowing whether his collection had survived. It had. When the siege of Leningrad was finally broken in January 1944, the collection was intact. The seeds that Vavilov's colleagues had died to protect had survived the longest siege of a major city in the history of modern warfare. Trofim Lysenko continued to dominate Soviet biology until 1964, when Nikita Khrushchev was removed from power, and the scientific establishment finally felt safe enough to dismantle Lysenkoism. The damage to Soviet agriculture during the Lysenko years was incalculable. Vavilov was officially rehabilitated by the Soviet state in 1955, 12 years after his death. The Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry still exists today. It sits in St. Petersburg, the city that was Leningrad, the city that was besieged, the city where Vavilov's colleagues chose to die rather than eat the seeds. It still holds one of the most important collections of plant genetic material in the world. In the decades since Vavilov's death, the science he pioneered has become one of the most practically important fields in human biology. The genetic diversity he spent his life collecting has been used by plant breeders to develop disease-resistant varieties of wheat, drought-tolerant strains of rice, potato varieties immune to the blight that caused the Irish famine. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, the facility buried in a Norwegian mountainside that serves as the world's backup copy of agricultural genetic diversity, is the direct institutional descendant of the idea Vavilov built his life around. The number of people alive today because of crop varieties developed using the genetic material Vavilov collected is impossible to calculate precisely. It runs into the billions. Trofim Lysenko is remembered as one of the most destructive figures in the history of science. A cautionary tale about what happens when ideology is allowed to override evidence, when political power is used to suppress scientific truth, when the state decides it knows better than the data. But the lesson of Vavilov is not simply that Lysenko was wrong and Vavilov was right. The lesson is about the cost of the interval between the two. Vavilov was right in 1940. He was officially acknowledged to have been right in 1955. 15 years. During those 15 years, Soviet agricultural science was run by a man whose theories were fraudulent, whose methods were worthless, and whose political influence was used to imprison or kill the scientists who told the truth. The crop failures that followed were not accidents. They were the direct consequence of choosing ideology over evidence. And Vavilov knew, from his prison cell, what was happening. He had spent his life studying the conditions that produced famine. He understood, with a precision that no one else in that cell could have matched, exactly what Lysenko's dominance would mean for the people who depended on Soviet agriculture to feed them. He asked for scientific journals. He wanted to keep working. Even from prison, even starving, even with no prospect of release, he wanted to keep working on the problem of feeding the world. There is a particular kind of person who appears rarely in history, someone whose commitment to an idea is so complete, so genuinely larger than their own survival, that even the most extreme circumstances cannot redirect their attention from the work. Nikolai Vavilov was that kind of person. The seeds he collected are still there. In St. Petersburg, in Svalbard, in seed banks on every continent that trace their institutional DNA back to the expeditions he led, the science he built, the collection his colleagues died to protect. He never stopped believing the work mattered. He was right.